my name is Lyn Stevens and I'm one of the curators at the Museum of Childhood in Edinburgh. That means I have the lovely job of looking after the museum collections, learning about what it was like to be a child in the past, and then telling everyone what I have learned through talks, exhibitions and films. I'm going to talk to you today about some of the older toys and games we have in the museum's collections and what children your age might have experienced in the period from 1880 to 1945. So about 140 years ago to about 75 years ago, when your grandparents' grandparents were children. I thought I would start with the ideas that many people have about what life was like for children in the past. These two Christmas cards are from the 1890s, and they show well-dressed, healthy children in warm houses with toys to play with. The ideal idea of Victorian children. But only a few families would have had homes like this, with children playing in a nursery, a room just for them, and probably being looked after by servants. The cards are interesting, though, because they can show us the fashion for children's clothes at this time and what children might have played with, but also how Christmas might be celebrated. So we can see a rocking horse and a doll's crib or bed, and we can see that there were Christmas trees and decorations. So some of the Christmas traditions would have been similar to today, but the tree would have been lit with candles with real flames rather than the electric lights we use today. However, these illustrations on the Christmas cards only show the life of a few lucky children in the 1880s and early 1900s. A lot of families, although not rich, would have had reasonably comfortable houses and enough to eat. But there would also have been lots of homes that were cold, damp, crowded, and the children would have had very few toys and would often be hungry. Here we see a wee boy fast asleep after a busy day, and the note at the bottom of the photo says, "The result of being tired and eating a geely piece," or jam sandwich. In the poorer families, the main diet would have been lots of bread and some soups or stew, but not much meat, which was too expensive to have very often. There definitely wouldn't have been many foods that we are familiar with today, snacks such as crisps and yogurts and chocolate biscuits. This little boy asleep in the chair doesn't look as if he would have been one of the very poorest. He has reasonably neat and clean clothes, and there is a doll by his side, and the chair looks clean, and he's wearing sturdy boots. The children in the other photograph, in a group with the man, are, however, from the very poorest part of Edinburgh at that time. The Cannon Gate in the centre of the Royal Mile was a very poor area of Edinburgh for many, many years. These children you can see here are attending the St Saviour's Child Garden in 1906. They aren't old enough to go to school yet, but they would have been playing on the streets or left at home with other children while their mothers had to go to work. This nursery was set up to provide a place where they could play and learn safely. These children would often not have had shoes to wear or enough to eat, so very different from the life of the children we saw in the Christmas cards. Most children would have spent a lot of time playing outside. Poorer children especially would have spent a lot of time outdoors as there wouldn't have been much space for them at home. They may also have been sent to look for ways to earn money, like carrying shopping or taking messages. Every small coin would help put food on the table for the family. Although there wouldn't have been many cars on the streets until the 1950s, there would have been traffic in the form of horse-pulled vehicles in the larger towns and cities, although children in the countryside would have lots of open space to play in. What do children play with outside? They may have played imaginary games that needed no equipment, such as you do today. So chasing around and playing tig or hide and seek, or marking out hopscotch on the pavement. They also played with skipping ropes and sang rhyming songs. These photos show a skipping rope, some marbles and spinning tops. But these were all simple and cheap toys, and some children may have had more expensive toys. You can see a very fancy sledge which was bought in Glasgow in 1909 and would have been very expensive. It's designed to seat two children one behind the other. It has metal runners along the bottom, so it probably would have gone very fast down a snowy hill, and I imagine it would have been great fun to ride on. Let's look at some other expensive toys. A doll's house was something that would have cost a lot of money, so most children wouldn't have had a shop-bought one. But quite often a child might have had a homemade one instead. The house in this photograph is based on a real house in Stockbridge in Edinburgh in 1899, where the lucky child owner would have lived. Dolls' houses would often be made in the fashion of the day. and so the furniture inside and the style of house would have looked like the houses the child was familiar with. Also shown here is an advert in a magazine called Hobby's Handbook, and this is from 1934. It has patterns and kits to make doll's house furniture from, and is the kind of thing that would have been used by a parent to make the doll's house for their child. One of the biggest doll's houses we have at the museum was owned by a girl who also made up stories about who lived in the house and what happened to them, which luckily she told us about. The house has 18 rooms, electric light fittings, and was lived in by a doll that was called Mrs. Nellie Bly. The little girl who originally played with it kept it all her life and added dolls and furniture over many years. Here we see inside the dolls' houses. The rooms were often perfect miniature versions of real houses, but homemade dolls' houses could have been just as much fun with less detailed furniture. Children could have enjoyed themselves choosing what colour to paint the walls and imagine their dolls' lives within the rooms. The Museum of Childhood has a very large collection of dolls, and most girls would have had at least one doll during the time we are looking at between 1880 and 1945, even if it was a homemade one. The group of dolls you can see here are made from a bisque, which is a kind of china that your plates and mugs are made from. Bisque dolls were most popular in the 1800s up to 1900, but could also have been made of wood, wax, and leather at this time. This would have been way before plastic was widely used. These dolls were expensive and broke easily, so you had to play with them very carefully. And the wax dolls could melt if you sat them too near the fireplace, which at this time would have been a real coal fire alight in the fireplace. Not all dolls were expensive though, and parents could make them for their children out of spare cloth, known as rag dolls, and draw a face on a wooden peg. The shoe doll is very unusual that you can see here. Someone has made a face on the underside of the heel of a shoe and dressed it. This doll was collected in London in 1905 and is very rare, as most people wouldn't have kept these homemade dolls made from scraps. The wooden doll you can see shows a soldier from World War I, which was from 1914 to 1918. It is dressed in the uniform of that time. Many children then would have had fathers, uncles, and older brothers away from home fighting, and many toys and books in the collection show pictures of soldiers. And of course, toy soldiers were also very popular too. Teddy bears were another popular toy. Teddy bears were invented by a disabled woman in Germany and have been with us for over 100 years. Margaret Steiff was born in 1847 and was left unable to use her legs and one arm after catching polio when she was little. This is the days before there was a vaccination for polio. She was taken to school in a handcart by her brothers and sisters, where she learnt to sew as well as read and write along with all the other children. At first she worked in her sister's dress shop when she was older, but eventually she had her own business where she made clothes and then soft toys from a soft fabric called felt. At first she made toy elephants and then lots of different animals. The first bear was made in 1902 and became extremely popular in America, where it was known as the teddy bear after the name of the president at that time. These two bears are some of the first ones that were made, dating from 1906 and 1915, so both are over 100 years old. Since Margaret invented the teddy bear, lots of famous bear characters have been created. You probably know some of them, like Paddington Bear and Winnie the Pooh. So what other toys did children play with between 1880 and 1945? Board games were very popular, just as they are today. This board game you can see is from 1910, which is a car race from Edinburgh to London. This was from a time when the invention of the car was quite new, and only a few people owned one. One of the hazards along the way on the board game was that your vehicle might catch fire, and this is what some of the early cars actually did. This game of racing cars would later turn into electronic games like Scalextrics and then computer games. The same racing idea just changed with the technology available. Children would have read lots of books too, books and comics and magazines. Here you can see one of the first Beatrice Potter books for Peter Rabbit, which was published in 1902. You may have seen the film version of this story. Children would also have played with jigsaws, clockwork toys, scooters and construction toys like Meccano, where the pieces of metal you could fix together would make buildings, trains or machines with moving parts. You can still buy Meccano kits and lots of other construction toys like Lego. In the time we're looking at, computers were of course not invented, so all the shopping for toys was done in-store or by post. You could browse a catalogue at home and order items to be posted to you over the telephone or by letter. The catalogue you can see here is from 1933 and shows us some of the soft toys you could buy from a big department store called Gamages. There were lots of department stores from the 1890s onwards, and they nearly always had a toy department and a spectacular window display at Christmas showing all the toys that you could buy. So at the museum we have thousands of toys and games and books, but what is harder to find is examples to show you of how children use their imaginations to play and entertain themselves. Remember, there would have been no television, let alone digital screens. There were radio programs for children from 1922, but otherwise you had to use what was around you and your imagination to have fun. One thing we do have in the museum to demonstrate your imagination of children is their creative writing. Some children wrote their own stories and made magazines with their friends. The photograph you can see here is of a girl called Ruth Dent. She invented a magazine called Pierrot. The one you can see here is from 1913. She would start the magazine off herself with a cover and a story and then post it to her friends, who would add their own stories and post it on to another child for them to add theirs. Post was the only way they could have communicated with each other at this time. Telephones had been invented but weren't in people's homes yet until much later. Toy trains were also a very popular toy. The first ones were wooden, like this one, and were pushed along by a child. Then there were steam ones with real small fires on board to boil the water and make the trains move along a track by themselves. They would spill quite a lot of water and were known as piddlers. Then there were clockwork trains you could wind up with a key to make it move. And finally, by the 1930s, came electric train sets, which you can see here on their tracks. Being part of a club or group activities was very popular in the 1920s and 30s. Some clubs were run across the country by organisations such as the BBC Radio Circle Club for Children. There were programmes on the radio especially for children, and nearly every house would have a radio. This is how people would hear the music, listen to the news, and also hear comedy and drama. National newspapers had cartoons of characters like Rupert the Bear in the Scottish Daily Express, and these also had popular clubs for children. You would send off a form in the post to be a member and receive certificates and badges, like you can see here in this photograph, and you would also have magazines to read. Some of your friends might be in the same club, but it was for children across the whole country. There were also clubs where you would meet with local children to play sports or games. Especially popular at this time were the Scouts, Girl Guides, and the Boys and Girls Brigades. In the 1920s, it was quite a new idea that exercise and outdoor activities were healthy and good for you. Before this time, people may have thought children should not exert themselves too much in case it damaged their health. But people had started to realize that children could be taught how to be healthy and learn to work together. And this could mean they would grow up to be responsible people contributing to society. There was also a lot of poverty in cities, and the clubs meant that children could come together in a safe space and learn some skills that would help them later in life. There were lots of fun and games too, of course, and days out to the seaside and picnics were organised. These were such a big deal for most children, as they wouldn't have had family holidays at this time. Some of you may go to clubs or brownies or scouts now. It might be interesting to find out when your particular group started, and you might be surprised by how long it's been running. In World War II, which began in 1939 and ended in 1945, Britain was at war with Germany, and sometimes German soldiers were taken prisoner and shipped to Britain to be kept in what were called prisoner of war camps. Some of these camps were near Edinburgh, and we have at the museum some toys that were made by the prisoners for local children. The prisoners often had a lot of time on their hands, and making toys would pass the time. Sometimes they helped on local farms and gave local children the toys. This parrot was given to a little girl who lived in a village near one of the camps in 1942. It balances on its stand and swings to and fro. This wooden cart and horse was also made by a prisoner in 1945. The German prisoners may have had their own children or little brothers and sisters at home and probably would miss their families terribly. Today we carry around in our pockets a small device, a mobile phone, that we can watch films on, make phone calls, listen to music and message our friend. It's a calendar, a calculator, and a library of information from the internet. The children who were growing up 100, 150 years ago did not have access to this sort of technology, but inventors were starting to make discoveries that have led to the technology in our pockets today. In 1890, the American inventor Thomas Edison created the first moving picture camera. Still photographs had already been invented, but this was the first time a moving image could be projected onto a screen for people to watch. The phrase moving image is where we get the word movie from. Edison went on to invent more machines, including toys for children to play with that created images and sounds. This machine is an Edison Bell pictogram from 1927. It worked by winding up a handle at the side, which meant a series of cogs and wheels moved a record or disc at the bottom at the same time as the image moved at the top. The image is a roll of drawings on paper that moved across the opening as the story you are listening to progresses. The sound you would hear comes from a record, which is a disc that has a groove in it, and a needle is placed in the groove, and as it goes round, it makes the sound of someone telling the story. There are YouTube videos you can watch to see how this works. The other toy you can see is a French toy called Le Praxinoscope. It is much older and from 1890 and much simpler. Inside the round sides, you can see there are a series of images and mirrors. Each image is only slightly different from the others. As you spin it around, the mirrors show the drawings and it looks like the image is moving. So a horse will look like it is galloping or a bird flying. It is a bit like a flip book, where you draw a slightly different picture on each page and then flick through the pages to make it look like it's moving, like an animation or cartoon. There are also YouTube videos to show you how to make one of these flip books. Both of these toys would have been very expensive, so most children wouldn't have owned them. But by the 1930s, nearly every child would regularly go to a cinema on a Saturday morning when screenings were made especially for children and cheap tickets were available. There were lots of adventure films and sing-alongs with the words on the screen to follow. Thousands and thousands of children went every week. Remember, this would have been years before anyone had a television at home. Finally, I want to show you one of our more surprising toys in the collection. This Radio Rex toy is from the 1920s. It was probably the first ever voice-activated electronic toy, but 100 years before Alexa or Siri. It had a small terminal at the back that you fixed an electrical wire to, and then you said the name Rex loudly, and vibrations of the sound waves pushed the very lightweight plastic dog out of his kennel. The deeper your voice, the better it worked. So a very simple toy compared to the technology we can use today, but the dog moving by the sound of a voice probably seemed like magic to a child in 1920. I hope you have enjoyed hearing about some of the toys in the museum collection. Perhaps you could use some of the ones I have shown to think of ideas about making your own toys or games, or write stories about the children who may have played with them. Thank you for listening.